Right. So today I will be explaining to you. So explainkan aku apa pasal oxygen dissociation curve. Okay. So what exactly is the oxygen dissociation curve? And firstly, what we will do is we will actually recall, just briefly recall about the hemoglobin structure. Okay. So that's the first thing that we're going to do. Is number one, we will recall hemoglobin structure. Okay, just very briefly as well. So number two, what we're gonna do is we're gonna jump straight into the behavior of hemoglobin molecule. Behavior of hemoglobin. So this is the part that we are talking about, the graph, which we will have a look later. Okay. Number three, how the behavior actually changes, and that behavior, the behavioral changes, is what we call as the Bohr shift. And number four, lastly, what we're going to look at is we're going to briefly discuss about how transport of carbon dioxide actually takes place. Okay, so in this video, these are the stuff that we are going to look at. So recall about the hemoglobin structure, behavior of hemoglobin, the Bohr shift, as well as the transport of oxygen and the transport of carbon dioxide. Right. So firstly, about the hemoglobin structure. So as you know, the hemoglobin molecule okay, so these hemoglobin molecules, they are very much abundant in your red blood cells. Apa maksudnya much abundant? So there are banyak berhabis area your red blood cells. Okay, so inside your red blood cells, you probably have about millions of them. Red blood cells, and you have millions of them. And what are they? They are essentially the red pigments. Okay, so they are the red pigments. So they are the one that actually gives your red blood cells its red color. So that's why your blood looks essentially very much the color that it is. Okay, and if we look at one of your red blood cells, you will have millions of them, and of the millions, if you look one of the hemoglobin molecule, what we could see is that they're actually made up of 4 polypeptides. Okay, so what are these 4? They are made up of 2 alpha and 2 beta polypeptide chains. Okay, so you should be able to recall this about the 2 alpha and the 2 beta polypeptides. So what simply means 1 alpha plus 1 alpha plus 1 beta plus 1 beta polypeptide. So that's what we call it as 4 polypeptide. And this is an example of a quaternary structure. Okay, so it's an example of a quaternary structure. What is a quaternary structure of protein? So essentially, it is a very complex protein, right? And you should be able to know that each of the polypeptide, every one of them, each actually contains the heme group. Okay, what exactly is heme group? Heme group is essentially your iron group. Okay, and this ion is the one that actually they are the ones that actually will combine with your oxygen molecules. So this will combine with oxygen molecule. Okay, to form the oxyhemoglobin. Right, so this is the one that you are familiar with, the oxyhemoglobin, the oxygenated blood. So why do we call it as hemoglobin? It's the oxyhemoglobin. It's simply because the oxygen molecule actually combines with the iron group inside each of the polypeptides. So since we have 1, 2, 3, 4, so since we have 4 polypeptides, and each polypeptide actually contains one heme group. So in other words, they are able to carry 1, 2, 3, 4 oxygen molecules. And when we talk about 4 oxygen molecules, so it simply means that there are 4 pairing of oxygen. Okay, 4 pairing of oxygen atoms. So if you look in terms of atoms, so it would be 8 atoms. But if we look at in terms of molecules, then it would be 4 molecules of oxygen, okay, for each hemoglobin. And so this is about the recalling of the hemoglobin structure. Okay, so that is done now. So the next part is we're going to look at the behavior of the hemoglobin molecule, right? So what is the behavior of hemoglobin molecule? Well, so the behavior of the hemoglobin molecule, we can actually present them in the form of this graph here. Okay, so this is the graph that you should be quite familiar with. This is the one that you should concern yourself with, right? And this is what you call as the oxygen dissociation curve or graph. Okay, and what it looks like is this. On the y-axis, you will have the percentage saturations of hemoglobin with oxygen. So what it means is berapa banyak oksigen yang bercampur dengan hemoglobin. So how many oxygen are actually combined with the hemoglobin molecule. So that is on the y-axis here. And the x-axis, on the x-axis, what they are actually showing you, and they are actually showing you the partial pressures of oxygen. Partial pressure of oxygen. So in simple terms, what it means is oxygen concentration, right? So here, this is the curve, this is the graph, and the behavior of hemoglobin molecule will actually depend on the partial pressures of oxygen, because they have a slightly different behavior when they are exposed to low concentrations or when they are exposed to high concentrations of oxygen, right? And this is what the graph will actually look like, right? So they will actually have what we call as a sigmoidal curve, okay, or sigmoidal graph. So the graph will actually look something like, right? And this is the sigmoid shape, okay? Sigmoid shape or sigmoid curve, right? And this is the graph, the shape of the behavior of the hemoglobin molecule. So what it's saying is, okay, so there are two things that you need to keep in mind. So to make it easier for you to understand is when you see this curve, below the curve, yang bahagian bawahnya, okay, bahagian bawah sini is essentially, we can call it as keeping. Okay, so it will make sense later nanti apa maksudnya keeping. And above the curve, okay, so the area above the curve, right, as we can keep in mind as giving, right? So area under the curve is keeping, area above the curve is giving. So what do they want to keep? What do they want to give? So essentially, Maksudnya keeping sini is the hemoglobin, okay, the hemoglobin molecules, how much oxygen, okay, how much percentage saturation of oxygen. So in other words, how much oxygen is the hemoglobin keeping? Berapa banyak yang hemoglobin itu simpan? Berapa banyak oksigen yang ia simpan? Okay. Whereas kalau yang atas, berapa banyak oksigen yang ia bagi? Okay. And this behavior will actually change according to the partial pressures of oxygen, according to the oxygen concentration available. Okay. So contohnya is this. Okay. So for example, okay, let me fix this first. Yeah. So if we look, for example, at low partial pressures of oxygen, okay, so low partial pressures of oxygen, so here, low low O2 concentration, okay, and you have areas where there is going up. Kalau ke atas, kalau makin banyak, artinya high O2 concentrations. Okay, so if you go to area where there is low concentrations of oxygen, apa contoh-contohnya? So the contohnya would be respirating tissue. Okay, so you're actively respiring tissue. So for example, your muscles, so whatever it is lah. Okay, sorry about that. Let me fix this again. Okay. Right. So respiring tissues is contohnya your actively respiring tissues. So contohnya, for example, your muscles. Right. And here, kalau high oxygen concentrations, where it is, arah badan kami yang banyak oksigen, contohnya is actually your lungs. Okay, because inside our lungs is where we have a high amount of oxygen available, right? So what it means here is, kalau misalnya kami agak arah tempat respiring tissue, okay? Kalau kami agak arah tempat respiring tissue, and as you know, kalau respiration, what do they do is they actually respiring tissue ini they need oxygen kan? They need oxygen untuk apa? For aerobic respiration. Okay, so the tissues, the muscles, whatsoever, they actually need the oxygen for aerobic respiration. So as a result, what the hemoglobin, what the red blood cells, which contains the hemoglobin, will do is that during this area, masa low oxygen concentration, okay, so during this area, so what they will do is the hemoglobin, okay, so what does the hemoglobin do? So the hemoglobin will keep, okay, so if you see below the curve, they only keep a low amount, sikit saja yang ia simpan, keep few O2 to themselves. Okay, so they keep a few oxygen to themselves, and what they are more likely to do is they are more likely, kalau kamu lihat sini, if you see above here, they are more likely to give. So if they keep a few amount of oxygen, so in other words, they are more likely to give more O2 to others. Okay, so they give more oxygen to others. So who do they give it to? They give it to their respiring tissues. Okay, so which makes sense. Kalau agak arah tempat muscle, tempat respire, orang berguna oksigen. So apa hemoglobin buat? Ia bagi oksigennya. Okay, and when they actually reach at a high oxygen concentration, so when they actually need go to the lungs, right? So when they go to the lungs, so the lungs is they do respire, yes, but the major function of lungs is to actually absorb. So there is a lot of O2 available. Okay, and the function of lungs is to absorb O2. Okay, as you know that they are responsible to oxygenate your blood, so to make it oxygenated semula, right? So since arah lungs kami, arah the lungs alveoli, particularly arah the air spaces of the alveoli, that actually have a lot of O2 available. So what will the behavior, sorry, what will the behavior of the hemoglobin would look like? So they would look like macam ni. Okay, so at high concentrations of oxygen, arah lungs kami banyak oksigen. So apa yang akan buat ia punya grafnya, ia punya hemoglobinnya. Sorry. So the hemoglobin, right? So as you can see, at high concentration of oxygen, the hemoglobin will keep, which means they will store, they will take in. Okay, so they will keep the O2 to themselves. So they will take in. Okay. Okay, so they are more likely, so in other words, they are more likely to absorb the oxygen as opposed to them giving out the oxygen. Okay, so as opposed to give less O2 to, right? So this, again, it makes sense. Kalau misalnya banyak oksigen, function of hemoglobin ini is untuk membawa oksigen, to take in oxygen. So kalau ia agak arah tempat banyak oksigen, of course ia akan ambil banyak-banyak oksigen itu untuk disimpannya. Supaya apa? Kalau ia berjalan, darah itu berjalan mengagak, going to all the respiratory tissues. When they go to the respiratory tissues, now the behavior changes from this into this. Right? So now the behavior changes from cemani menjadi cemani. So in other words, they are more likely to give. Once sudah dorang giving, habis sudah oksigennya, dorang mengagak ke lungs, arah lungs banyak oksigen, banyak yang ia ambil. Okay, so and the cycle goes and on and on. So this is what we call as the oxygen dissociation curve. Okay, so I think the most important thing to remember is below the curve, is you can think of them as keeping or absorbing the oxygen, how much they keep, how much they absorb, whereas above the curve is how much they give, how much they release the oxygen, okay, to the respiratory tissues. And this is what you call as the oxygen dissociation curve. And this is how the hemoglobin behaves according to different partial pressures of oxygen, so different concentrations of oxygen, right? So we've looked at this. So 1 is done, 2 is done, behavior of hemoglobin. Now we are going to relate it to number 3. So number 3 is the Bohr shift. So apa Bohr shift ini maksudnya? So here, okay, Bohr shift. Okay, so what you will have, okay, Bohr shift is not much. It's quite simple. It's quite easy to understand. Okay, apa maksud Bohr shift ini? So well, basically it's the same graph that we have here. Okay, same axis. We have the PO, partial pressure of oxygen. I'm just gonna simplify it. Okay, same thing, oxygen concentration or O2 concentration. Whereas on the y-axis, same thing as well. We have the percentage saturation of hemoglobin with O2. Okay, so it's essentially just the same thing, right? But okay, what is Bohr shift about? Right? So essentially, you have the curve. So this is the original curve. Okay, so the original curve, when you have Bohr shift, apa maksudnya? Ia punya curve-nya ni becoming okay, so the curve is becoming this. So essentially what happens is this curve has been shifted to the right. The curve is shifted to the right. Okay, so maksudnya yang ni awal-awal curve-nya ni ia makin ke kanan. So makin ke kanan maksudnya apa? So ia makin apa tu even at higher partial pressure of oxygen, slightly higher. Kalau kami lihat sini, let's say originalnya awal-awal, let's say we give this at 10 partial pressure of oxygen, they're able to keep, okay, kita lihat bawah, keeping bawah. Originally, they're only able to keep, let's say 10 Celsius, we make it as 5. Okay, so at 10 partial pressure of oxygen, they're able to keep 5. But when they are exposed to Bohr shift, when this happens, the Bohr shift happens at the same partial pressure of oxygen, 10, but now they're only able to keep, berapa yang dorang keep, let's say they only keep 2. Okay, so in other words, they are making it more, okay, essentially making it more likely to keep, making the HB hemoglobin more likely to keep O2 than to release it. Sorry, not more likely to keep, sorry. It's making it more likely to give. Okay, because it's getting lower to keep. So in other words, more likely to give. So they're making the hemoglobin more likely to give oxygen than to release it. More likely to give oxygen. So this is essentially what the Bohr shift is about. Okay, so they shift the curve ke kanan, dia tukarkan curve-nya tu ke kanan supaya apa? Supaya lagi banyak yang ia bagi daripada yang ia simpan. Okay, so they are more likely to give rather than to keep, because as we see here, partial pressure of oxygen 10. Kami lihat sini ia keeping berapa? Ia keeping 5. Artinya yang ia bagi, let's say the maximum is 100. So 100 minus 5 is 95. 95 yang ia bagi. Okay, but when you shift it to the right, what will happen is that suddenly, at the same partial pressure of oxygen, they only keep 2. So which means they now give 97%. Okay, 97% they give when you shift the curve to the right. Masa ia shift, tukar curve-nya tu ke kanan. Right? So this is what we call as the Bohr shift. Right? And this apa Bohr shift, maksudnya curve-nya tu kena shifted ke kanan. So what? Kalau ia ke kanan, maksudnya making the hemoglobin more likely to give. Okay? So makin ke kanan, makin banyak dorang bagi. Okay, makin sikit yang dorang simpan. So this is the Bohr shift, right? And when, bila this could happen? Okay, so this actually happens all the time in your body. Okay, so this is the curve. If you recall, so the oxygen dissociation curve here. Sorry. I'll just fix it. Yeah. So the oxygen dissociation curve here, this is clearly the theory. But in reality, the Bohr shift actually happens. Okay. So why does this happen? So when does it happen? This happens actually because the number one. Okay. This happens a lot Because number one, at respiring tissue, okay, when your tissues respire, there is an increase in CO2 concentrations, right? And whenever there is increase in CO2 concentration, it will actually lead to number two, decrease in pH. So these two conditions is what is making the Bohr shift to happen. Increase in carbon dioxide as well as the decrease in pH. So in other words, decrease in pH is getting more acidic. Okay, and these two actually relates to one another because increase in CO2, makin banyak CO2, maksudnya makin banyak carbonic acid. Okay, CO2 when they dissolve in blood, they will actually become carbonic acid, right? Which we'll have it later as well. And of course, acid leads to the death. Okay, so increased CO2, they will actually lead to a further decrease in pH. Okay, so it makes sense how these two are linked together, right? So macam mana boleh this happens is because of this. Okay, and why does this happen? Is of course it makes sense because when you respire, okay, because tissues, you eat tissue respire, they will actually release CO2. Okay, so again, if they release the CO2, so which means ada the respiring tissue yang sini terjadi. Okay, so this release of CO2 is not just because of low CO2 causes the hemoglobin curve to become cemani, right? But sudah tak curve-nya cemani, makin banyak CO2, makin lagi ke kanan. So they shift it ke kanan lagi. So in other words, makin dia lagi much more likely to give, right? So this is why, and this is the basis for Bohr shift. Okay, so we have to look at that. And lastly, the one that we're going to look at is about the transport of CO2, right? So about the transport of CO2, firstly, we need to understand apa terjadi arah this CO2. Okay, so when your tissues are respiring, so you have the CO2, right? So you have the carbon dioxide. So what actually happens to this carbon dioxide, right? So, okay, so this carbon dioxide, okay, as we go through, so who actually release the carbon dioxide? So the tissues, respiring tissue, or the cell. So this carbon dioxide, they could either go CO2 of respiring tissues, they could either go, they would dissolve to blood plasma, and eventually enters into the red blood cells. Okay, so the red blood cells inside the blood plasma. Okay, now what will happen? Okay, so the carbon dioxide from respirations, okay, the produced carbon dioxide from respirations, they will dissolve and they will diffuse into the blood plasma, and actually a huge amount of the carbon dioxide dissolved in the blood plasma, they will actually diffuse into the red blood cells itself. Okay, so the carbon dioxide from the respiring tissues, they will go to your blood plasma. Okay, they will diffuse into your blood plasma, and inside the blood plasma, they will further diffuse into the red blood cells. Okay, most of it. Okay, not every one of them, but most of it will actually diffuse into the blood plasma, into the red blood cells. Now, inside the red blood cells, what are they actually doing? Okay, so this carbon dioxide, the CO2, will actually combine with water. Okay, they will actually combine with water with the help of enzyme, what we call as carbonic. anhydrase. Okay, so with the help of carbonic anhydrase, which is an enzyme found in the cytoplasm of the red blood cell, okay, they will actually change it into carbonic acid. So they will actually change it into H2CO3, which is a carbonic acid. Okay, and this carbonic acid molecule is actually quite unstable. So what they will usually do, once they form this, they will usually tend to dissociate. Okay, because they are quite unstable in the beberapa kuat, so they are more likely to pecah. Okay, so they will actually dissociate to form what? So they will actually form H plus ion and menjadi HCO3 minus. So they will actually become hydrogen ions and they will actually become the hydrogen carbonate ions, right? So they become this hydrogen carbonate and HCO3. So, okay, if you look at this H plus, sorry, no, we'll have a look at HCO3 anyway. Okay, so this HCO3 anyway, so if we see this CO2, they go into your red blood cell, combine with water with the help of carbonic anhydrase, they become carbonic acid, and they will then dissociate to become carbonic acid. Hydrogen carbonate. Okay, and this hydrogen carbonate will then, this is the main form in which your carbon dioxide gets transported. So about 85%. Okay, 85% of your carbon dioxide is transported in the form of this, right? So they become hydrogen carbonate. So they either remain in the red blood cell or they will actually diffuse back into your blood plasma. Okay, but most of them will actually diffuse back, and this actually takes up about 85%. Okay, so 85 of CO2 will get transported as hydrogen carbonate. Okay, now what happens to the rest? Well, 5%, okay, will be, as I mentioned earlier, most will be going into your red blood cells, but some will actually remain in your blood plasma. So apa yang they remain in your blood plasma, they will actually remain as dissolved CO2. Okay, so they will actually remain as dissolved CO2, and this is only about 5%. Okay, so they become dissolved CO2. So this is one form. Another form study 85%. So they will become as HCO3 minus. Right. So this is about 85%. And what happens to the rest of the 10%? So the rest of the 10% is actually the CO2 molecules. They will dissolve, and they will diffuse into the red blood cell, the blood plasma, eventually into the red blood cell. They will actually combine with, okay, the CO2 actually combines with hemoglobin. Particularly which part of the hemoglobin? The NH2 terminal, the NH2, the amino group of the hemoglobin. So this will actually form carbaminohaemoglobin. Right? And how do they actually do this? They actually do this with the help of the enzymes as well. Okay, so this actually takes place with the same enzyme, carbonic anhydrase. Okay, so the CO2 will also combine with the hemoglobin, particularly the amino terminal. Okay, to form what? Carbaminohaemoglobin. So this is the form that they go back, which is here. So it's about carbaminohaemoglobin, which is the rest of the 10% in which the transport of carbon dioxide taking place. So this is the ones that we have covered. Okay. Oh, by the way, there's also a link. Okay, so if you see here, okay, so this is a bit of extra how this process links with Bohr shift, right? So if you see the carbon dioxide, when they actually becomes the carbonic acid, and the carbonic acid dissociates to become hydrogen ions. And these hydrogen ions, as you might be familiar with your chemistry, this is your proton. Okay, and hydrogen ion is the more H plus you get, that means, okay, the more they dissociates, which means high H plus. Sorry, I'll just. Okay, sorry. Yeah, where is it? Okay. Right, so if you see here, red blood cell, CO2 dissociates into carbonic acid, and they also produce the proton, okay, the H plus hydrogen ions. So as you know, more H plus will actually lead to more acidic, and more acidic will actually lead to the pH, and more pH will actually lead to Bohr shift. Okay, so more H plus from the dissociations of carbonic acid, so which means it will become more acidic. And if it's more acidic, that means further decrease in pH. So if it's further decrease in pH, so it will result in Bohr shift. So in other words, the respirating tissue, now you can see how it links to Bohr shift as well. Okay, so respirating tissue, they produce this, and this will lead to in more acidic, decrease in pH, and decrease in pH, it will lead to Bohr shift. So as a result, Bohr shift happens, they will give out more oxygen rather than keeping it. Okay, so I think that's it for today, right? So I will post another video about the adaptations for high altitude. Okay, so there you have it. If you've got any questions, so please don't hesitate to let me know. Right, so that's it for now. Thank you and bye-bye.